Good morning. We will do whatever is necessary, says Israel. After the United States and allied forces scramble to help Israel thwart the Iranian attack, the world holds its breath. Is that it? Was last night the end of the confrontation or the start of a dangerous new conflict? 12 hours ago, Iran launched 200 drones heading for Israeli targets. So far, the defenses have held just one reported casualty. In Tehran, there's triumph at their show of strength. Iran's leaders signal they've made their point. But they will strike back if Israel retaliates. Israel's allies urge caution, but the next step is down to Mr. Netanyahu's war cabinet. They meet today. We'll get political reaction from Health Secretary Victoria Atkins and Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, with live updates all morning from our correspondents around the world. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. There is, of course, just one main story for us today: the Iranian attack on Israel, launched in retaliation for the destruction of its consulate in Damascus. Right now, the skies over Tel Aviv are clear, but this episode is far from over. The G7 and the UN Security Council meet today. But in truth, the next move is in the hands of Israel's war cabinet. To use the appropriate biblical metaphor, they have a choice: turn the other cheek or an eye for an eye. Let's get the latest from our team in the region, and I'm lucky enough to have in the studio through the show today our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. Dominic, what do we know about what's happening right now?
Well, Trevor, after an extremely worrying night, I think the onus now is on diplomats to try and calm things down. And for weeks since Israel's attack on the embassy, the Iranian embassy in Damascus, flattening the consulate building there, killing more than a dozen Iranians, including a number of senior commanders, the West has been saying to Israel and to Iran, do not let this escalate into something much bigger. So have been urging restraint on the Iranians. The Iranians did not listen to that, and now the Iranians have retaliated with extraordinary force. The first direct attack on Israel. We've seen a shadow war between Israel and Iran for years, but this is the first direct attack by Iran on Israel. That was clearly a sign the Iranians were not going to listen to those calls for restraint. I think the pressure now is on Israel to show restraint. And so Western diplomats will be saying to the Israelis that we've got your back diplomatically, and they'll be saying you don't need to take this further. Now, the Iranians have made it clear, or they at least publicly have said, they deem this affair concluded. The Israelis are sceptical about that. They say there could be more to come. I think the question for the West is if the West was attacked by 350 drones, missiles, ballistic missiles, would they think that it was now over in terms of would you just hand it over to diplomats to punish Iran, or would you feel that you had to retaliate? Will Israel feel it has to retaliate? Does it have to strike back now? It's kind of a question of who has the last word here. But as you say, it's down to the Israeli war cabinet. Will they be reassured by the diplomatic activity, or feel they have to do something now in return for what Iran has done overnight?
Well, let's get a sense of the mood in Israel now from our colleague Alistair Bunkle. Good morning, Ali. What's the situation there? Is the action for the moment over?
I mean, right now, as we speak on Sunday morning, the action is over after what was a very tense, busy and noisy night. I don't suspect many people here got much sleep. Things are pretty quiet here this morning. Sunday morning's the start of the working week here and across the Middle East, but schools have been shut for today and for tomorrow. The airspace has reopened, so that's a positive sign. Gatherings have been limited in number, and so the country, if they went to sleep at all, is waking up to what happened overnight and trying to understand what comes next, as you were discussing with Dominic. On the one hand, given what Israel did by carrying out this attack in Damascus and killing a senior IRGC commander, the fact that Iran's retaliation really did very little damage, material or physically, here in Israel. There was an airbase hit, but it's still functioning. One child was badly injured by shrapnel, but from what I gather is the only casualty that we know of so far. And most of the drones and the missiles were actually shot down before they even got into Israeli airspace. I mean, you take all those things together, and it's sort of turned out pretty well for Israel. But it's more than that, though. That's not enough. It is about image. It is about restoring and underlining the deterrence. And that mutual deterrence that has existed for so many years between Israel and its enemies, Hezbollah in the north, Iran, well, that has been eroded big time. And that is why the Israelis might feel that they have no choice but to reassert it.
Just before I come back to Dominic, Alistair, what's the mood in Israel? Because, of course, the War Cabinet isn't just considering military questions, but also political questions. What's the pressure in Israel today?
Well, I mean, it's funny that the dynamic has sort of shifted over the last 6 months as the war has gone on. Immediately after October the 7th, there was a sort of a unity in Israel that I hadn't really experienced for some time, certainly not during this latest Netanyahu government. But as the war has worn on, that has eroded. Support for the IDF remains very strong. Support for Netanyahu does not. People have different reasons for wanting to see him thrown out of office, whether it's his handling of the war, whether it's the fact that he didn't prevent it happening in the first place, or it's because a no hostage deal has been agreed. And incidentally on that's gone slightly unnoticed. Hamas this morning came back and said they reject the latest proposal, so that is a big blow there. When it comes to what happened last night, I think you'll find that the country is broadly supportive of the government on that. Iran is seen as the big threat to Israel. Everything else, its proxies are the sort of smaller threats, but Iran is the big threat to Israel, and so Israelis will be supportive of their government and their military in taking what action is necessary to keep them safe.
So thanks very much. I think we'll talk to you again a bit later. Dominic, we know that the G7 nations are going to have a call today. What do you think they're going to say, and what impact do you think that might have on the situation?
Yeah, Joe Biden's convening the G7, that's the group of 7 industrialised nations, mid-afternoon by video call. And also we're going to have the UN Security Council meeting as well at some point later today in New York. And I think they'll be trying to choreograph a united call for calm and restraint in the region. You know, this is a very dangerous moment for the region, the most dangerous moment, I think, obviously, since October the 7th. And there is a huge potential for this to escalate further. If there are further attacks coming from Iran, that could obviously lead to escalation. But also Israel, if it retaliates in any number of ways, could lead this into a deeper and more worrying escalation. I mean, Iran's air defences are no match for Israel. So it will be tempting for the Israelis to launch strikes in retaliation for what's happened overnight. And if they strike something and kill a number of Iranians, the Iranians will need to respond. They've already said that if Israel does retaliate, they will retaliate much stronger than they did last night. So it's a dangerous situation, and diplomatically the West will be urging Israel and Iran to calm down, to draw a line beneath this, and not to carry out any more actions like an attack on the embassy in Damascus or like this unprecedented missile attack overnight, so that we can step back from the brink.
OK, we'll talk further in a moment. But as we've been saying, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has condemned the Iranian attack, and he said that the UK will continue to stand up for Israel's security and that of all our regional partners. The UK's military was reportedly involved in supporting the defence of Israel overnight. So let's get the latest from the UK government this morning. A little earlier, I spoke to the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins. Victoria Atkins, your reactions to events overnight in the Middle East?
Well, this was a significant attack by Iran on Israel. It is a huge relief to everyone concerned that the reports from Israel suggest that the injuries and the cost to the local population was as small as it appears to be at the moment, although I'm very conscious this is a moving situation and more details will emerge. But we want to ensure now that this does not escalate. And so our message to everyone is that we have to contain this, we have to work with Israel to ensure that they are supported, but to do so in a way that helps to de-escalate tensions in the region, because this is not what any of us wanted.
I want to come to the issue of de-escalation, but just dealing with last night, what can you tell us about the involvement of British forces?
Well, again, I'm sorry, I'm going to be saying this rather a lot today. This is a live operation or live military situation, and so I am constrained as to the details that I can provide at this moment in time. But British jets, UK jets, were sent to the region as part of what's called Operation Shader, which is an anti-Daesh initiative. What that means is basically bolstering our resources in the region. That happened overnight, but I can't go into further details, I'm afraid, as to what those jets did overnight.
But broadly speaking, this has been an operation which involves us, the Americans, the Jordanians, dealing both with Iran, but also the terrorist threats that infest the region.
Well, we, of course, have already, over several months now, worked with our international partners to tackle the attacks by Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. But apart from that, obviously, we also have longer-standing commitments in the region. As I say, all of our efforts at the moment are on de-escalating this. We do not want this to go any further, because we can all see the human cost to this, and we do not want a miscalculation or an escalation in events, because we know that that will take its toll on.
Okay, one more thing to it. The answer to this may be completely obvious, but what is the official advice now to British travellers and indeed Britons in the region?
That's really important. So anyone who is in the region, please look at the FCDO website. That advice is kept up to date and reviewed constantly. And you'll appreciate there are different pieces of advice for different parts of the region. But in terms of travel to the region, again, please look at the FCDO website. We've been quite clear for a while now as to which areas it is not safe to travel to. And so I'd really urge people to look at the website for the most up-to-date information.
That advice is being reviewed, and do you expect it to change?
Again, I'm in the hands of FCDO and the Foreign Office, the assessments that officials will make at the Foreign Office. It is genuinely kept under constant review, not just as a result of last night's situation, but also in the longer term. So please check the website if you are thinking of travelling into the region.
All right, but there will be a call amongst G7 leaders, the 7 most powerful nations. There will be a meeting of the UN Security Council. But in truth, the next step is in the hands of the Israeli War Cabinet, isn't it? What are we saying to Israel?
Well, the Prime Minister held a Cobra meeting on Friday. He was kept updated throughout yesterday and last night and has had calls already this morning. There is planned to be a G7 leaders call later today, and updates will emerge from that. But we continue to work and to support Israel in its efforts. But again, our message across the region and with our partners is that we must not escalate this. We must contain this and just take time to look at what has happened over the last 12 hours. It's obviously, as I say, a very, very live situation, and to see what more can and should be done. But we do not want to escalate this situation.
This didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, the Iranians are clear that this action is retaliation for the Israeli attack on their consulate in Damascus. First of all, I don't know if you can tell us this. Did the Israelis consult anybody before they did that?
I'm not privy to any such conversations if they happened. I hope you'll appreciate that. It's a defence matter as well as a national security matter, and so you'll appreciate the circle of knowledge on this is very, very small. But in terms of our relationship with Israel, we have been very consistent in our support for Israel to defend herself after the appalling attacks in October last year. But we have also joined with international partners in saying, actually, the best thing for Israel and for the region is for there to be an immediate humanitarian pause so that we can get hostages out. There are still people being held captive. Get the hostages out, get humanitarian aid into Gaza as quickly as possible. And then we must, if the future of Palestine rests on, we believe, Hamas no longer being in charge of the government, and so there will need to be a change of leadership and for then the two-state solution to be looked at in the longer term.
But the reason I ask you that is that, as you said, we are a staunch ally to Israel. And sometimes your best friends are the people who have to tell you that you're about to make an error. Now, I'm not making a judgment about this, but it is puzzling. Right now, we don't even actually know officially whether the attack on Damascus was an Israeli attack, but most people think that, and the Israelis have not denied it. I wonder what we think the Israelis imagined they were doing and what we have had to say about it, because the Israelis are not unsophisticated. They're extremely smart. They're experienced. They must have known that this would be the outcome. So what do we imagine the reason for the attack on Damascus was?
Well, I hope you'll appreciate I'm very cautious about daring to speculate as to what other international leaders may have been considering when it comes to such delicate matters. But what we do, we are very, very conscious of the fact, as I say, that Israel had this horrendous attack deployed against it in October. People in Israel are suffering. People in Gaza are suffering as well. I think we all acknowledge that there has been a great deal of humanitarian loss and cost to this. And this is why we want this immediate humanitarian pause. But in terms of the future, the Prime Minister will work with other international leaders. We, of course, will also have, there will be many, many conversations ongoing at the moment between our allies, between our international partners, to try to contain this.
The Iranians have been pretty clear this morning that if there is an Israeli retaliation, they are going to come back in kind and more. They've been pretty clear about that. Where are we on this? If the Israelis say we have got to respond because all the reasons that we know before, will we support them?
Again, I hope you'll appreciate, we are having to take this a step at a time because it's a live operation. I can't, with the best will in the world, provide a running commentary on what may happen. We have to take it methodically a step at a time. And there are so many other actors in this on the international stage, of course.
It looks as though you will get your Rwanda bill through this week. When can we expect to see flights taking off?
We want them to take off as quickly as possible, and so...
The days, weeks, months?
We are certainly...
We need to get our cameras ready.
Certainly within weeks. We very much plan to have it within weeks. And what this is about is deterring not just the criminal gangs, but also the message to people further down the line that the UK is not here to be entered illegally, if you like.
OK, no, that's helpful, actually. It's clearest. Do you have a carrier yet? I mean, the Rwandan air company said it wouldn't carry these people. Who's going to take them?
The Home Office is working on this, and so, believe you me, the Home Office is ready to go.
They haven't got one, have they?
Piece of legislation
They haven't got anybody to take them, have they?
Well, we want to get this piece of legislation through. Yeah, we have seen some real progress in the last year with the reduction in small boat crossings by a third, which is contrary, actually, to the trend we've seen across the European continent. But this is one part of our overall plan to cut illegal migration.
All right. I want to be fair, because there's something that you have to say about today. The smoking legislation, which is going to be passed, I think, this week, will ensure that nobody who is currently under 14 will ever be able to buy fags, right?
Yes, so the plan is that anyone aged 14 at the moment will never be able to buy cigarettes from a shop, and we're beginning the debate this week. The arcane traditions of the House means I won't be able to pass it, sadly, on Tuesday, but we've got more to do.
Is this a new kind of conservatism? Is this bossy Toryism?
I don't think it is.
Why not let people decide whether they want to smoke or not?
No.
I've never smoked myself.
No. So, to me, this is absolutely about the Conservative principle of looking after and protecting future generations. And just as we as Conservatives are fiscally responsible, we do not want to hand on debt repayments that we have built up through the pandemic to future generations, which is why, as well as managing the economy as skillfully as Jeremy and the Prime Minister have, we also want to ensure that we're removing the double taxation on work through our tax cuts that we've brought in this month. But it's addiction. We want to free future generations from the risk of addiction to nicotine.
You know they're going to call you Nanny Atkins, don't you?
Well, Trevor, thank you for that. I think you just put that name in my mind. Thank you. But no, this is about protecting future generations from an addiction to nicotine. No smoker wants to take up smoking. You know, they regret it, and we want to stop children from doing that and taking up this very, very harmful habit.
Victoria Atkins, Health Secretary, thank you very much indeed. I should, of course, apologise to the Health Secretary because I misled her into saying that it was 14 and under. In fact, it is 15 and under in the legislation. Now, let's get reaction from our panel. Former Downing Street Communications Director, Craig Oliver, broadcast and journalist, Daisy McAndrew, and former Labour Communications Director, Tom Baldwin. Craig, you've been through this kind of moment, I think, more than once. And actually, you've probably been talking to your friends in Downing Street. What's the feeling there?
Well, I've been in touch with a couple of people in government today, and I think there are two big messages they're trying to get across. One is support for Israel. The second is that a lot of the action took place actually over Iraq, and US missions were happening there, and British planes were able to backfill there to stop some of the missiles getting through. But I think that the main message that they're trying to get across, and they want to say today, is that, look, we're going to do everything we can to try and take the heat out of this. We do have diplomatic relations with Iran. David Cameron spoke to their foreign minister last week. He spoke to Minister Gantz in Israel yesterday. I think everything they're saying is, look, we need to just de-escalate. We need to take the heat out of this. And I think that is a big worry that Netanyahu will feel that he's backed into a corner in some circumstances in the next few days, may feel that he has to retaliate again, and then so it goes on. And that is the big fear.
Daisy, what's your estimation of where this is going to go? Spiral up or spiral down?
Of course, that's the big question that everyone's wondering this morning. And I also think it's interesting to look at where this leaves Israel strategically, in that many people saying this could have been a bit of a strategic error on Iran's behalf, because, of course, last week, Israel was looking increasingly isolated. It was getting a lot of pressure from its allies, both from London, from Washington, to de-escalate the war in Gaza. And now everybody's, as Greta was saying, everyone's rushing to cosy up to Israel. So could this have been a mistake by Iran? I think also Netanyahu's domestic situation might be bolstered by this. He's been getting huge protests, huge criticism from Israelis wanting to see a change from Netanyahu. But given that this last night went relatively well for Israel, as in very limited casualties, could it have bolstered his position?
Tom, we'll come to the issue of choices in a second, but it is quite striking that a lot of this seems to be about signalling rather than actual military advantage.
Yeah, I think I was talking to someone who knows far more about this than I do last night. He said that he thinks Netanyahu is among a number of actors in the Middle East now who want to escalate rather than de-escalate. He wants a forever war to shore up his position in Israel. It's the only way he can survive politically. And therefore, unconditional support for his government and what his government does is becoming a very uncomfortable position for many of Israel's traditional and steadfast allies.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, that's interesting, because if I read the statement from the Americans and also from the British, they have support for Israel, not the Israeli government. But is it possible, in reality, to make that distinction?
I think in the end you're going to have to. proportionate self-defence does not usually involve bombing an embassy in another country. It is becoming, Israel cannot function alone without its allies, and Netanyahu is making Israel quite lonely at the moment.
And I think it's really interesting, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but what Craig said about Foreign Office being in touch with Benny Gantz, not Netanyahu. Benny Gantz, of course, is Netanyahu's #1 opposition, who's calling for elections, who keeps reminding people that Netanyahu's facing 3 trials for fraud and corruption and so on.
So Gantz is in the war cabinet?
Yes, he's in the war cabinet, but he's calling for elections. Just last week, he was saying that 70% of the population wants elections in September, that it's time that maybe his support for Netanyahu in this emergency wartime government, that the support is spreading thin now.
I think what we're all seeing is here, it's hard to see what the trajectory is, isn't it? Long-term trajectory. At the moment, after last night, Netanyahu's position has been rather bolstered. The President of the United States has had to come out, David Cameron come out, make very, very clear whose side that they are on, and also make clear that Iran needs to get back in its box. Netanyahu will like that. Whether or not that lasts long-term is the big question. He's a deeply unpopular figure in Israel, but he is clinging on, and the more that Israel is seen to be under threat, the more chance I think he has of holding on.
Yeah.
I mean, what's striking here is that almost everything that happens seems to reduce everybody's choices. The Americans can't now lean on Netanyahu because that might look disloyal. The opposition in Israel can't follow up on their pressure for elections because then that looks like you're breaking up the coalition and so on. Is there a real problem here that there may be a kind of a situation in which everybody is forced into the wrong position simply because of the rush of events?
Yes, I think that is a real concern. And of course, before this happened, we were waiting, certainly in Israel, they were waiting for some sort of retaliation to the attack that Tom mentioned to come. Meanwhile, the far right of the coalition government was making Netanyahu promise to go in on that offence in Rafah, saying that, unless the hostages are released, we want you, Netanyahu, to lead this, invasion into Rafah. So you've got a situation where things are looking more and more out of control. As Tom said, we've got Netanyahu clinging on because he knows the minute he loses his grip, his political career is over. And you've got 2 nuclear nations. And given that Trump pulled out of the Iran deal back in 2018, I struggle to think of a worse situation.
Tom, are you comfortable with our support for both for the Israeli situation, the Israelis now, and our government's position?
I think our government's position has to be held to account. We haven't yet seen the legal advice over arms sales to Israel. What I do think, though, is, I look at Labour's position, I hear lots of criticism of Labour's position. Why can't you take a stronger stance? I know what Labour is trying to do, which is to demonstrate that in government it will be a stable ally rather than somebody who will sort of try and posture for the sake of it. I think it's quite important that in a very, very unstable situation, there are people ready to be stable, there are people ready to be grown up, and there are people always willing to compromise, because the events in the Middle East are driving out compromise and driving out nuance, and people need to stand up for both of them.
I always worry about the emergence of strong but stable on this programme, but let's not...
I don't think I use that phrase.
Yes, let's not go back. Craig, you've been through this sort of situation. Talk us through, what will they be doing in Number 10 today? What's the process? What happens?
Well, look, 2 things. First of all, I would say is, look, Netanyahu is an assiduous politician, and what he's doing is posing to the West an unanswerable question. What would you do in these circumstances? And actually, the answer is, we'd be pretty tough in return. So he's using that and hanging over. In Number 10, I think they'll be saying, look, what can we do to speak to our allies, the United States, that kind of thing. There is going to be a G7 meeting that Biden has called today to say, look, what can we possibly do to take the heat out of this? The world is deeply worried that this could escalate. That could have all sorts of not just military consequences, but also financial consequences around the world. And so I think the G7 meeting, Britain will say, look, we're ready, reporting for duty. Anything we can do to take the heat out of this, we will do.
What do you think, briefly, Rishi Sunak is going to do? What's he thinking at this moment? What are his choices, if any?
Well, I think exactly that, to show up for duty at the G7 meeting, to say constantly and clearly, and what diplomacy can we use around the world to take the heat out of this. We've got a limited role in that, but that means largely being behind Biden and making sure that you're fully supportive of what the American policy is.
OK, we'll come back to you all in a moment. It is now 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Israel launched an unprecedented direct attack on Israel overnight. A barrage of missiles and drones were shot down by Israeli defences with help from the United Kingdom and the United States. Iran says the attack has concluded, but Israel remains on high alert. No one was killed and there was almost no damage. International leaders have called for restraint and de-escalation. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has spoken to President Biden, who will call a meeting of G7 leaders later. In the last hour, the Health Secretary has told this programme that United Kingdom military jets were sent to the region overnight, but the government here wants to see de-escalation. Let's get the latest now again from the region. Our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, is live in Jerusalem for us. Alistair, the Israeli War Cabinet is going to meet today. What's going to be in front of that group, and what do you think they're going to be saying to each other?
Well, they'll be doing a situational assessment. So, firstly, they will be looking at what they know about the attacks last night. What did Iran use to throw at Israel? And not just Iran. We know that the attacks also emanated from Lebanon, from Yemen and Iraq. So what intelligence have they gathered to build a bigger and more detailed picture about this Iranian attack, and how well did their own systems, and I should add to that, their own allegiances with the United States and the United Kingdom, how well do they function in terms of protecting Israel? The answer is very well indeed. The IDF in their preliminary assessment believe that 99% of the drones and missiles fired at Israel were shot down. If you look at the damage assessment, that is pretty minimal too. A child in the south of the country, badly injured, but I think doing okay, but the only injury that we have been told about. And then in terms of actual material damage, the worst seems to be a direct hit on a Israeli airbase, but not so severe that it has stopped the airbase functioning. Actually, the Israeli military this morning were broadcasting live footage of jets taking off and landing there to make that point. So Israel, in a way, has sustained an unprecedented attack, a very large attack, more than 300 projectiles, more than 130 ballistic missiles. But it has sustained it. It has defended its skies successfully. It has come away from it pretty much unscathed. And so that will be seen as a major plus point. But will retaliation from Israel's position be necessary? Because image is everything here in the Middle East, and Israel will want to make sure it has restored deterrence.
OK, thank you very much, Alistair. Back with me now, our international affairs editor, Dominic Wyckoff. Dominic, let's first talk about the politics in Israel, and then let's talk about the wider situation. Craig Oliver was saying, actually, that there is an issue here, which is within Israel itself, what's good for Benjamin Netanyahu may not be great for Israel. What about the politics of Israel, and how is that going to affect the decision-making of the War Cabinet?
Well, I mean, the sort of background to this is that before the war, before October the 7th, before that terrible day of massacres in the kibbutzes in the area around Gaza, Benjamin Netanyahu was a weakened prime minister. He'd been trying to push through judicial reforms that had alienated the more liberal, secular part of Israeli society. It was a more and more divided and polarised society. And the people we were speaking to, for instance, a man whose family had been kidnapped, but saw himself very much as a secular Israeli living in Tel Aviv on the more secular coastal side of Israel society. He said, I want to go to war, I want to be recruited, I'm waiting for my recruiting papers. But I'm being criticised by all those groups who've said that I wasn't patriotic during all these protests we've been carrying out against Netanyahu. So it was and remains a deeply divided and polarised society, and this war hasn't helped in some ways around that, but it has rallied Israelis around the government, particularly around the military, as they agree that Hamas needs to be dealt with, whatever that means. Now, I think what's happened overnight will have strengthened Netanyahu to some extent, but I think there will be Israelis who will be worried about the fact that the attack on the embassy in Damascus on April the 1st led to this. I think Israelis will be reassured by the fact that it seems that their air defence is held up, and also very much so that the allies, the British, the French, Germans, Americans all seem to have rallied around Israel, but also some Arab states also seem to have helped Israel defend itself against this onslaught. But I think at the heart of it, Israelis will remain deeply worried. They are in a situation where the war in Gaza does not seem to be achieving any of its objectives, and the region is certainly not getting any more stable.
OK, I'm going to come back and ask you about that attack in Damascus a bit later, but I want to bring you the interview that we did earlier on with Yvette Cooper. Keir Starmer says that Labour condemns what he called the unacceptable attacks by the Iranian regime. He said the party will stand up for Israel's security and that we must do all we can to prevent a wider war. Well, a little earlier, I did speak to the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. Yvette Cooper, your reaction to the events overnight in the Middle East?
Well, we strongly condemn this reckless attack by Iran on Israel. There's been a real concern from the very beginning about the risks of escalation. And whilst the international community has been urging restraint, instead, Iran has chosen to do the opposite. I think all of our concerns will be for the security of people right across the region now, and it's very important that everything possible is done to prevent further escalation and to try and maintain people's security in the region.
I want to come to the risk of escalation in a moment, but it is reported that there has been British military involvement. We're not clear about exactly what it is, but RAF has been involved in some way, shape or form. Are you supportive of that?
Well, as you say, we don't know the details, but clearly I think it's in everyone's interest to have prevented the Iranian attack actually having potentially could have been a much more serious impact on people's lives. And so, of course, if UK forces are involved as part of defensive action, that is really important, and you would expect that sort of thing to happen. But I think the most important thing now is to prevent escalation. This is about the security of Israel, but also the security of Jordan, Iraq, other partners that we have in the region, and also people right across the Middle East, where the government has rightly said it is working now to trying to stabilise the situation. The UK government has said it is working to try to stabilise the situation because nobody wants to see further bloodshed take place.
I know that it's impossible in these kinds of situations to be precise about what your reaction might be, but broadly speaking, were our government to decide that it had to engage in a military fashion in any way, will Labour, broadly speaking, be in support of that if it's part of something that the allies of Israel undertake?
Well, I think this is exactly the wrong time to speculate about what may happen next. Both the UK government, we've seen the Prime Minister talk about the importance of the international work now in order to prevent further escalation in the region. Nobody wants to see a wider regional war in the Middle East, and that's what all efforts now have to be around. There's been talk about the UN Security Council discussing this, around the G7 discussing this as well, and I think that's what everyone's focus will be. But look, this has been part of a a continued operation by Iran, by the Iranian regime, to destabilise the Middle East, often through different proxies, through support for Hezbollah or for Hamas, and the security threats that can pose. It's really important that restraint has been the part of what the international community has been urging, and to strongly condemn the response from Iran.
The key player today, of course, will be Israel itself. And there are many voices saying, as you say, restraint. But there are also voices saying that Israel has to demonstrate that it won't be pushed around, that it is strong, and so on. What would be your message to the Israeli War Cabinet?
I think our concern is for, as it has always been through this, is to ensure that we don't have a wider regional war take place in the Middle East. That would be deeply damaging for Israel. It would be deeply damaging for people living right across the Middle East. And that is immensely important. It is something that really the UK government has talked about, the Labour Party has talked about really throughout all of this, all of the events that have been taking place in the Middle East. We obviously are continuing to argue for the immediate ceasefire that is needed in Gaza, where so many lives have been lost, where we need the release of the hostages, and we need not just the security, but also the humanitarian aid that is desperately needed. But we also, in the light of what has happened overnight, need really this concerted action of all countries, not just in the region, but internationally, working to prevent further escalation in the light of these truly appalling attacks.
I don't want to make this a domestic issue, but of course, this is the Middle East, Gaza specifically, has been a tricky issue for the Labour Party. There are different views within the party. Is there any risk here, do you think, that there may be different points of view emerging? Because there are some people, I guess, within the Labour Party who will say that actually the problem here was Israel's attack on Damascus.
Well, I think we've seen, look, there's a history here for Iran's operations in the region. We have seen really not just their operations in the region, we have obviously seen deeply concerning over some time operations in other countries as well, including concerns about the IRGC operations here in the UK, where we've seen obviously attacks on the Iran international journalists and other concerns more widely about security, as well as their long-standing operations within the region. So that's why I think it's really important for all of us to strongly condemn the Iranian attacks and their decision to escalate things. So I think that is important, and I think everybody would agree with that.
All right. You won't be surprised that I want to ask you about the situation with Angela Rayner. There's a police investigation going on, so obviously we can't discuss the rights and wrongs of that. But one of the things that I think interesting here is that she's repeatedly said that she was advised legally she'd done nothing wrong. Keir Starmer says that members of his team have seen that advice. Is his reluctant, but he hasn't, is his reluctance to read that advice deliberate or just because he hasn't got time? Why does he not know what that advice says?
Well, let me just say this, that Angela welcomes the opportunity to set out all of the facts, be it with the police, the HMRC, or the appropriate authorities. And she has done the right thing by taking the independent tax and legal advice, and has been clear throughout that she has acted in accordance with it. I certainly wouldn't expect to see her their personal advice about the personal finances of any of my colleagues. But I think Angela's handled this in the right way, and it welcomes the opportunity to be able to set out the facts.
That wasn't really what I asked about. It's puzzling that the leader says, members of my team have read this advice, but I have not. Is that deliberate?
I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for him to do.
It's a bit puzzling. He used to criticise Boris Johnson for not paying attention to detail, not reading his papers and all of the rest. This is a big deal for Labour. Why doesn't he acquaint himself with his own deputy's defence and advice.
I think Keir has a very strong team around him, and rightly so. And that's why I think, you know, not only have they looked at this and been clear about it, but also Angela has as well. And look, you know, Angela's a brilliant deputy leader of our party, and she is going to continue campaigning, continue working, just as all of us are, for the local elections, and not be deterred by, you know, what we know is going to be political questions that are always going to be raised.
Well, you say that, but, I mean, let's be honest. Look, the reason that this is an issue more than any other, you know, some people would say, and I probably think I'd agree, that at some level, it's not the biggest of deals. However, here's the reason that it's a problem for Angela Rayner. When Boris Johnson was investigated over Partygate, she insisted that the mere fact of an investigation being launched should have been enough to provoke his resignation. Here's what she said. Boris Johnson's Downing Street under police investigation. How on earth can he think he can stay on as Prime Minister? Disgraceful. How on earth does she think she can stay on as Deputy Leader of the Labour Party?
Well, I think these are very different circumstances. You know, the issues that have been raised are about what happened nearly 10 years ago, before Angela became an MP.
That's not the point she made. She said somebody's under investigation. They shouldn't be in high office.
But this is about the context of the investigation that was happening while the Prime Minister was in Downing Street, when we had already been raising continuing concerns about what he had said in Parliament, about him misleading Parliament, about not giving accurate information, and at a time when he was responsible for all of these things. So, look, I do think these are different situations. But why do the rules apply
to him and not to her?
The reason I think I would
You guys say one rule for them, one rule for everybody else.
I do think these are different situations, and I think Angela has also said, you know, at one point has said that, look, if the Prime Minister wants to publish all of his tax returns from the time before he was an MP, then she would do the same. So this is different situations because we are talking about before Angela became an MP. But the other thing I would say that is really different here is that what Angela has said, which is also what she said around the allegations that we also had made by the Conservative Party as part of the run-up about Durham, was that if she's found to have committed a criminal offence, she would resign. We never had that from not just the former Prime Minister, but also the current Prime Minister, and a series of other Conservatives have been challenged. So I think there is a big difference, and that's why I think, look, everybody, you know, supports the strong campaigning that Angela is doing.
Well, we shall see how this develops. Yvette Cooper, thank you for your time this morning. Still with me, Craig Oliver, Daisy McAndrew and Tom Baldwin. Tom, loyal opposition, and I guess that's the right place for them to be, isn't it?
I think a loyal opposition also holds the government to account. It's not unquestioning opposition, and you've seen Labour begin to shift its position in accordance with events. Now beginning to scrutinise whether there should be continued arms sales to Israel. I think that's the right thing to do. But if we're going to get anything other than a regional, perhaps even, you know, I hope not, but global conflagration out of this, in the end, there's going to have to be compromise. There's going to have to be a ceasefire, and then there's going to have to be further steps towards some sort of solution. Now, there's lots of actors in the Middle East who don't want that. I think the Labour Party's right to continue to have a nuanced, grown-up, stable position, because in the end, as Keir Starmer said in his big speech about this at Chatham House, the colour of peace is never black and white, it's always grey. We need to have compromise. We do not need posturing by British politicians at the moment.
And as you were saying earlier on, this is in a way Labour demonstrating readiness for government and so on. But Craig Oliver, is it a factor for the government, for Number 10, how the opposition behaves?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I think, look, the reality is the UK opposition is never going to be able to make a huge amount of impact in these circumstances. What I think Yvette Cooper was trying to do there was take the opportunity to reassure people that the Labour Party has changed dramatically from the days of Jeremy Corbyn. And as I was listening to her, I was imagining what this day would be like if Corbyn was still in charge. For the Labour Party, it would be a deeply awkward, painful day with lots of people attacking the Labour Party. I think what she has very effectively done is said, look, we are grown up, we do feel we're part of the international community, and we are going to support our government and the US government.
I think that's absolutely the role. As far as domestic politics goes, for an opposition at the moment, is to present themselves as grown-ups who the public could imagine sitting, in that room and running things. And I think possibly at the moment, the only good card in the Conservative deck of cards is David Cameron. I think that's when you put David Cameron against David Lammy doesn't, apologies, Tom, it doesn't look like as much of a grown-up. So, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot more of, although David Cameron is very, very busy at the moment, I think, I wouldn't be surprised to see quite a lot more of him versus Lammy.
I mean, it's easier to look like a grown-up if you've been Prime Minister.
Of course it is, of course it is.
If David Lammy wants to call in, we'll take his call. Right. Next, just how big a threat to the future of the Conservative Party? Actually, this is we were going to talk to the boss of Reform, but I'm afraid he's had to move to next week. What we are actually going to do is go to a break. Thanks very much.
Tell me about the competition. Where did this come from? Hobby horses have been around for centuries. When did it get competitive?
Well, I think it's competitive across the world and in Australia. For us, we do the children's entertainment, and the inspiration is really from watching our little ones play in a piece of grass just outside the marquee where we do the children's entertainment in their spare time. And we thought, you know what, we could put on little competitions for them. So our chief executive, Karen Wood, looked across to gain on how we would run these events. And we start our first qualifier within our championships this weekend. We are a huge society nationwide with 20 areas. So different areas are running the competition where the top 3 children in each section will qualify to go towards our championships, which will be run in August. It brings the children together. If you watch them playing together, they're very inclusive and they help each other. And sort of even now, the interaction between the children before the competition is, what have you called your pony? Are you going to plait it up? Is it going to have ribbons in? We've just started. This will be our first year. It's all about the children having fun. We run an event to raise money to put on our children's entertainment, and we also have some sponsors. So this is free. All the children will join in free. So
it's just the free, and it could be the start of something wonderful by the sounds of it. And for those naysayers out there, it was actually proposed for inclusion at this summer's Olympics in Paris. There is a very serious hobby horse community out there.
Earlier in the programme, the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, told us UK military jets were sent to the Middle East. But this was thought to be in support of other ongoing operations in the region. Let's talk now to our Defence and Security Editor, Deborah Haynes, who is in Brussels. Morning, Deborah.
Good morning.
Deborah, what's our role here? What's the UK play?
Well, the UK is obviously a close supporter of Israel, but it's taking an interesting stance here in terms of the way it's describing its role. The US military has very clearly said that its jets were flying in support of the Israeli operation to defend its airspace overnight from this unprecedented Iranian barrage of ballistic cruise missiles and also these explosive drones. For the UK, they said that they deployed additional jets, these are Typhoon jets, along with refuelling tanker aircraft to an airbase that we have in Cyprus, RAF Akrotiri, where the UK already has a deployment. It's been there for years, operating against Islamic State, Daesh, in Iraq and Syria. It's called Operation Shader. Now, ostensibly, this increase in jets to Cyprus has been as part of Operation Shader, so not a new mission. However, the aircraft that were deployed last night, and they don't deploy every night, so the fact they were deployed last night is clearly because of this threat that was happening, this known attack that was coming from Iran, and they were given permission to shoot down any Iranian missiles or drones as part of that mission, which would mean that it would be in the area that they would be operating in. So they weren't flying around Israeli airspace or Iranian airspace. They would have been over Iraq and Syrian airspace because that's where the mission is conducted. We don't know yet what, if anything, they did shoot down, but clearly if they had those permissions to do that, then you can expect that perhaps they did use that. And the Ministry of Defence will surely update us on what it was doing. I was also told that this operation, they described it as Operation Shader Plus. They were basically filling in for American jets that would otherwise perhaps have been doing that so that these American aircraft could focus on the Israeli mission. So it was all part of what was happening overnight, but the UK has deliberately, it seems, chosen to be a little bit distant in the way that it's describing the support that it was given. And of course, behind the scenes, the British officials, American officials, Western officials have known now that ever since that strike, which Iran has squarely blamed on Israel and Israel has not commented on, in Damascus against that Iranian consulate building, that there would be an Iranian response. And the big thing now is to try to contain that. But that seems very, very difficult after last night's barrage.
Deborah, thanks very much indeed for that clarification. Let's go back to our panel now. Craig Oliver, Daisy McAndrew and Tom Baldwin. Craig, you were looking a little bit doubtful at the last thing that Deborah said there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Deborah's reporting the facts perfectly accurately, but I think that the interpretation of what's gone on over Iraq last night, I would put more emphasis on the British involvement there. When I've spoken to people this morning, what they're saying is that there was pretty major American campaign to basically defensive, stop a lot of these missiles coming through, and that British jets were involved, making sure that they were backfilling, supporting that operation. I suspect as the day goes on, we'll hear a bit more about that. And it is genuinely significant, I think, that the extent to which the Americans were doing that, but also that Britain was a part of that. They are signalling very, very hard that they will be part of defending Israel if push comes to shove, and as it did last night.
And I think it's worth noting also that what's being reported in Israel is not what's being reported here. So Israeli journalists are reporting that RAF jets definitely did shoot down Iranian drones last night. The MOD hasn't commented either way yet, but that might just be because they haven't formulated those words that the press officer isn't ready to push the button, and they might be waiting for Washington to wake up as well.
Yeah, we actually are not reporting that. We don't have any confirmation on that. And, call us over-scrupulous, but that's how we are here at Sky. Let's talk a little bit about the situation in the whole of the region. That account tells us that there's a sort of dizzying array of players now involved here. And one thing that we do know is that the Iranians tactically like chaos. They like the instability involved here. Do you think that at some level, what is now happening is that there's going to be a shakeout? Daisy, I'll come to you first. In the region, because the Jordanians and the Iraqis have clearly joined, as it were, this alliance.
Yes, I mean, I think that does come back to what all three of us were saying earlier about whether this is a strategic error. As you were saying, Iran definitely likes chaos. It's trying, it felt it had to retaliate after the April the 1st attack in Damascus. And you can see what they were trying to achieve. It's just interesting that so far it's brought the allies, the Western allies, together in support of Israel, which I don't think would have been what they wanted. But it's fragile. That alliance is fragile at the moment. There's a lot of criticism of Israel.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult for your Jordanian and the Iraqi governments to be seen as, defending Israel or supporting Israel, and they're not. What they're doing is trying to prevent further escalation. And shooting those missiles down last night may have helped further escalation. And that seems to me a good thing to do.
Well, it would have been quite an important decision for the Iraqis to make, to allow British and American fighters to operate in their airspace.
Well, they have been for some time. So I think that's a significant thing. I think if you're talking about the region in general, I think a lot of people look back over the last 10, 20 years and think that Iran has become stronger and stronger in the region. A lot of people blame, the invasion of Iraq as causing that. But the strength of Iran, I think, is deeply worrying, and also being seen increasingly internationally as working with other authoritarian regimes. The relationships with Russia, that kind of thing, are deeply concerning. And there's a much bigger geopolitical game that's at play here.
I'm no expert on Iran, but I think it's probably worth saying also, though, that Iran itself has its own internal troubles. I mean, it has a very young population, which perhaps isn't quite as stuck into the sort of the Ayatollah thing as one might imagine. They've had various kinds of instability, particularly about the treatment of women internally. And to some extent, I wonder if what we're seeing here is not just Iran retaliating, but trying to demonstrate to its own people that it's got guns, it's got power.
And it is very easy when you're talking about sort of geopolitics and other countries to forget that there is domestic politics going on in those countries as well as international politics, going exactly to your point. And also, of course, we know that more countries around the world are having elections, very significantly, United States later this year. What's that going to do to the US-Iranian relationship? That will be significant if it is Trump that comes back into the White House. We mentioned earlier, he's had plenty of dealings in that region in the past. So lots of people will be thinking about November when they're thinking about their domestic politics at the moment.
OK, I want to come back to talk about the G7 and the UN Security Council later on, but let's take a break. After that, we'll look at the military options for both Iran and Israel and how a regional conflict could escalate. Welcome back. Let's focus on the military action in the Middle East overnight. Almost all the drones and missiles fired by Iran were shot down by Israeli defences with support from its Western and regional allies, including the United Kingdom and the United States. I can speak now to Sky News military analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Morning, Michael.
Morning.
Let's start with the Iranians. People talk a lot about a calibrated response. What do you think the Iranians hoped to achieve last night?
They certainly hoped to achieve some hits, and they got some. They seem to have got 7 hits on the Nevatim air base, which is symbolically important to them, because the Nevatim base is the base, it's the F-35 base, it's a big air base in the Negev desert, which is where...
F-35 fighters.
Exactly. The F-35s took off from there to bomb the consulate in Syria, in Damascus, on the 1st of April. So, as far as the Iranians are concerned, they've hit the base from which the strike against their consulate was launched. So, symbolically, that's important. It is reported that they've done some damage to outbuildings, but there is no casualties. It has been reported around the Arab world that the base has completely been wiped off the map, which is clearly not true. So they got 7 ballistic missiles through. They launched, it seems, this is from IDF figures, the Israeli defence figures, they launched 110 ballistic missiles, and 7 of them got through. They launched 36 cruise missiles, none of them got through. They launched 185 drones, none of them got through. So statistically, less than 1% of their missiles got through, but the 7 ballistic missiles that may, if all 7 hit the airbase, that gives them a symbolic victory. So, you know, any reasonable person might say, well, that's tit for tat in terms of Damascus on the 1st of April and now the base from which the attack was launched now. Maybe that should be an end to it. Any reasonable person might say that. But we're dealing here with Netanyahu as Prime Minister and Ali Khamenei as the Supreme Leader.
And we are not talking about reasonable...
Neither of them are particularly reasonable.
The situation doesn't make anybody reasonable.
No, exactly. I mean, and this is, you know, this round of conflict, this particular iteration, started with the Israelis going after IRGC generals and, you know, in an embassy. Now, going after IRGC generals is acceptable in the sense that they are attacking Israel, and so Israel goes after them wherever they can find them. But going after them in a consular building in Damascus is specifically against international law. It's very provocative. The Israelis seem to do it out of the blue, almost as if they wanted to provoke Iran to see how much Iran would do in response. And the Iranians are now saying that this is the end of it. They have said, this is our response. Now, whether they'll stick to that, we don't know. But they've probably got enough out of this. 7 out of 331 missiles got through. That's a pretty low percentage. But if the symbolism of hitting the airbase is good enough, then maybe they'll say, that's it, we don't want any more.
So the outcome here was never really meant to be, as it were, a military advantage, but more one of storytelling, if I can put it that way, particularly presumably to their own people, because it's not going to convince anybody else, particularly.
Absolutely. And that storytelling began a few hours ago with editorials being written in newspapers and across the Arab media that the air base has been wiped off the face of the earth, which it clearly hasn't. So, you know, people's different narratives might actually be a way out of this iteration of the crisis. But everyone assumes that Israel, having been struck, now this is inside Israeli territory, albeit the Negev desert down in the south, but given that Iranian missiles have now struck inside Israel, will the Israelis say, well, we're not going to respond? The general view is that everyone will tell them not to respond. The Americans will certainly lean on them not to respond. Look, this is enough. This has gone far enough, and this now completes this cycle of violence from the 1st of April to now. But that Netanyahu won't be restrained because he's getting something out of this widening of the war. It keeps him in power.
Well, let's try to understand what the Israeli motivation here is. Starting with, what do you think the advantage of attacking a consular building was, given that, as you say, it's not unique, but it's very, very unusual, and it was bound to provoke a response?
Yes. I mean, the advantage of doing it is that you know that you're going to catch a number of people there, and so the people that they were after were in the building, and that it's a single target, and so technically it's a good target to hit, but it's a very bad target to hit in terms of legality, in terms of the perception. And, Israel has operated its war with Iran, its proxy war with Iran for the last 30-odd years in a rather choreographed way. And this was taking a step outside the normal choreography because the Israelis would say, well, look at what happened on the 7th of October. That was outside the normal choreography in a big way. The old rules don't apply. But the rest of the world has a problem with this. The Western world wants to support Israel, but they make it really difficult for Israel's supporters outside to keep on supporting them when they push the boundaries all the time. In specific terms and in general terms.
The other side question, as it were, the military strategy here, which is, for me anyway, quite hard to understand. Yeah. Why open a new front when you've already got a major thing going on to the south in Gaza?
Because the war in Gaza is not going terribly well for Israel. It is strategically incoherent now. The Israelis, in December, they had 18 brigades inside Gaza, about 90,000 troops. Then they went down to 1 brigade. They've just put a 2nd brigade in. So they've now got 2 brigades inside Gaza now, about 6,000 troops, which are not capable of doing anything other than keeping the road open that the Israelis have driven from east to west. It's not clear where that offensive is going or what they're getting out of it, because day after day they're losing politically because of the civilian casualties and their failure to really finish off Hamas. So the logic of widening this war is that for Netanyahu, it begins to address for him his view of the real enemy. A number of people inside the Israeli Defense Forces and Israeli defense establishment are saying, look, Hamas are not our real enemy. Hamas are a nuisance that we've lived with now since 2006, 2007. Our real enemy is Iran, and our real enemy locally is Hezbollah, who are the clients of Iran. The time has come to leave Hamas on one side and address the bigger issue, because this is now an existential crisis for us. This is the biggest crisis since 1948. Our existence is on the line. Get to the real enemy. There is a sense in which, in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, that is now the line of thinking.
Michael, thank you. That was really clarifying. Thank you so much. In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. Greg Milam, Sky News, Manchester.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent, and this is where I grew up. We can reveal that the driver who hit Harry Dunn is 42-year-old Anne Sakoulas.
Just met the president and we never thought we'd get this far.
This is what they're up against. The wind is the really big problem. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
I never knew they would make it. It's amazing.
Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
Back to our panel, Craig Oliver, Daisy McAndrew and Tom Baldwin. Tom, G7 call today and the Security Council, I think, a little later. Does all that matter? It's the Americans.
America's position matters. America is a major player, possibly the major player still in the region. So what Joe Biden says, what his administration does, really, really matters in the Middle East. What Britain says and does matters a whole lot less. We're not hugely influential in the Middle East. What we need to do is to build our influence up by showing that we're stable partners to our progressive leaders around the world like Joe Biden and standing by our allies within NATO. I mean, I think it's quite interesting when you think about Keir Starmer's foreign policy, what that would look like, because he probably more than any leader of the opposition before him has significant foreign policy experience. You know, as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, he worked with foreign governments on the death penalty. Then, as Director of Public Prosecutions, he represented Britain abroad in meetings with the US Justice Secretary. You know, he represented Britain in European meetings. And then, as Shadow Brexit Secretary, he went around Europe trying to get a better Brexit deal than the one we got. So this is someone who's actually worked with foreign governments before, and that's quite rare in a leader of the opposition, and he's learning on the job. I think he did screw up early in the comments he made about Israel-Gaza, that LBC interview.
Right at the very beginning where, yeah.
But what's interesting about him is how he corrects a mistake rather than doubling down behind it, and he's learned a lot about this.
Let's just more widely, Craig, I'm wondering if the happiest people this morning, if you can say happy about anybody, are in the Kremlin.
I think it's a good point. I mean, I think Vladimir Putin wants to see a destabilised world. He wants the attention of the world drawn elsewhere. And I think that is one of the concerning things about this, is that you can point to a number of people around the world, some of whom are in Russia, some are in Iran, some in Israel, who actually have a vested interest in escalating this. And you asked about the G7 and the Security Council there. I suspect what will come out of the G7 later is a very united message about de-escalation, taking the heat out of this. Security Council, much more interesting. Russia and China there, what do they say? What do they say in terms of affecting the heat of this situation? A much more interesting thing, I suspect.
And possibly the most important of all the bits of diplomacy and the meetings that are going on was that 25-minute call between Biden and Netanyahu, which, of course, none of us are able... There was a handout, a readout afterwards where Biden it was said that he'd called for restraint, but that's probably the most important of all the bits of diplomacy.
And it's having a very interesting impact on the US election, because traditionally a US president, it must be absolutely 100% behind Israel come what may. Interestingly, the way the demographics of the US are going at the moment, much more people worried about Israel, a lot more people more supportive of the Palestinian side, which is having an effect on Joe Biden. So he is trying to, he's trying to bridge a very, very difficult gap here, be 100% supportive of what is the only democracy in the Middle East, while also playing to back home, people saying, look, we're a bit worried about this.
Exactly. And of course, our domestic politics restarts tomorrow. The House of Commons, after its Easter recess, is back. We'll have Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, whether or not... And it's an interesting area where Tom was bigging up Keir Starmer's foreign policy experience, which I think is interesting. Of course, we know what Rishi Sunak's attack line is always, you supported terrorists, you represented terrorists when you were a lawyer and so on, and you get the whole lefty lawyer nonsense going on at Prime Minister's questions. So it'll be interesting to see if this also can take some of the sting out of that Angela Rayner story.
Well, indeed. You mentioned the Angela Rayner story, and I talked to Yvette Cooper about it. I suspect that will probably dominate for some days to come. Let's just talk about the spin cycle on this. Tom, they should have been able to shut this down before now, shouldn't they?
Probably. I think it's difficult to tell Angela Rayner what to do because she's a strong and independently minded woman, and this is about events before she was an MP. It doesn't relate to what she's done in Parliament or what she's done as Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. It's about before she was an MP, before she had clever accountants and tax lawyers. She's just a family solicitor and estate agent. That's the only people she spoke to for this. And so there is a kind of, this has got a very hot issue. We know the cycle that plays out. CCHQ are feeding stories into the Daily Mail, owned, incidentally, by someone who has avoided millions of pounds of tax, not £1,000 on, selling.
Well, let's be a little careful here. We don't. When you say avoided, we know that's not unlawful, but let's be a little careful here. But isn't the problem for her, but I want to come to you, Craig, because you have that sceptical look on your face, but isn't the problem here that Angela Rayner herself has not hesitated on the hair trigger to go after just about anybody who might have done something that somebody else thinks is a bit dodgy?
Yeah. I hate this kind of politics, and it's the saddest point in it. I suspect a lot of people are not really watching it. But the problem that Angela Rayner has got is, look, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. She dished it out big time, and she can hardly be surprised when the entire Conservative attack machine really goes for her. I do think they could have sorted it out a lot earlier. They could have shown redacted evidence that showed what had happened and whether or not she just paid the £1,000 or whatever it was and just got it over with. Instead, I suspect her sense of anger at the situation, her sense that she's being attacked because she's a working-class woman, which may actually be true, has clouded her judgment on this. This should have been dealt with a long time ago.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, all three of us have been in situations where we've had to spin stories for political parties. And there was always that cliche, wasn't there, that it's not the crime that brings you down as a politician, it's the cover-up. And actually, sometimes it's not the cover-up, only the cover-up, it's what Craig was mentioning, the look of double standards. That's something that people really hate. You say what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so she's struggling with both of those things, a sense that what looks like a cover-up and what looks like double standards.
We've seen this movie before, though. We saw it in 2022 when they all came after Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner over Beergate. Mm-hmm. And eventually, the Daily Mail and the Tories bullied the police into reopening an investigation, and guess what? They were cleared. And I think at the end of this, I mean, look, they're now trying to say, oh, she wasn't registered in the right place. It was kind of such a minor offence that you don't even get prosecuted for this a year afterwards. So they can't prosecute her for this. So I think what we're going to see is a similar cycle. I don't know, I'm not a tax expert, but I think we're in this cycle now where the Tories are trying to show that everyone's the same, everyone's sleazy, everyone's incompetent, and they're not the same. There is a difference.
Well, indeed. And all that relates to broader politics. And let's remember, we're a democracy. There will be an actual vote in a couple of weeks' time for quite a lot of people in local elections. What do you think, Daisy? What's going to happen? Does it matter?
Yes, it matters because, of course, it will influence the thinking of the political parties depending on how terrible a night they had or how fantastic a night they had. And there was a thought a few months ago that maybe May the 2nd would have been the general election, and then obviously that's been pushed to later in the year. So yes, it will matter. I suspect turnout will be pretty rubbish, because I think people feel so anti-politics.
Craig?
I think it's going to test the Conservative Party's ability to see 2 or 3 moves ahead, big time. The reality is it's going to probably be a terrible night for the Conservative Party. Do they start running around panicking, setting their hair on fire, saying, let's get rid of our leader, in which case it's quite likely that there might be a confidence vote, in which case Rishi Sunak wins it and is even more damaged than he is now.
Do you think that's actually possible?
It is perfectly possible, yes. And I think that what somebody needs to say to the Conservative Party is, look, it may be individually in your interests to cause that outcome, but for the good of the Conservative Party long term, it definitely is not. But whether or not the Conservative Party is capable of taking that lesson when the panic sets in is going to be the really interesting question.
Well, somebody needs to say, well, somebody has just said it. 10 seconds, Tom. Favourite one at the Grand National yesterday? You reckon that's what's going to happen in politics?
I think politics is very volatile. The reason why Keir Starmer's turned a 20% deficit into a 20% lead is because of that volatility, and everyone I know in Labour is not taking anything for granted.
Thank you all very much. It's been a busy day. That's it for this week. I'll be back next Sunday. Been a pleasure to be with you. Watch Sophie every night. Good morning.